Awesome. Cool. So thanks, Chris, for coming. I have a whole bunch of things I would be interested in digging into after kind of perusing through your site for a while, but maybe we could just have like kind of general purpose introduction and then overview, or just like maybe the kinds of things you want to talk about, and then we could uh,
Sure.
get
Yeah.
into it. Yeah.
Ask away, and then I'll fill in gaps as we need, or dig in further if people have questions, and we'll go from there.
Awesome. So yeah, your kind of introduction is a fairly wide-ranging thing. It's kind of chunked into a whole bunch of different sections. Maybe just kind of like yeah. How did you start? When did you start kind of putting this site together and working on it?
Um, the seeds of it started way back in probably 2004, 2005. Although there is some content on it that goes back into the 1992-ish time frame, I
Okay.
think. So I was going to college as the web was becoming a commercial, well, not even a commercial, but a pre-commercial academic thing. So I had a handful of, static HTML pages way back in the day. And then I got out of college, forewent any of I had some $80,000 a year job offers to write HTML for various companies. And I knew somehow that wasn't going to be sustainable. So I went to career number two. But sometime around 2004, 2005, I was tinkering around with, early versions of things like WordPress and Drupal, and started to build in there. And then, of course, the social media revolution hit, and I was knee deep in the midst of that. And essentially giving all my content away to third-party services.
Yeah.
Which I think many people have realized is not probably the best thing to do. But the nice part was I had the technical capability to spin up my own website, manage it, maintain it. So roughly about 5-6 years ago, I had 3 dozen domain names like everybody else out there, obviously. And I figured I'd just pick one and start hacking away at it just for myself. So it built up from there and has turned into, as of earlier this morning, I now have 17,000 posts
Oh
on
wow.
my website. So, and that's, only probably a fraction. There's tons of social media stuff that I've posted that I'm sure has disappeared, died, gone, or been lost.
So does that
So in a general
17,000?
sense, everything I post to the web, I either post first to my own website and then syndicate a copy out, or I may, in some instances, I'll post somewhere else, but I simultaneously scrape or pull back a copy of that and own it on my own site at the same time. So there's pretty much nothing I post to the web privately or publicly that I don't own.
Huh.
And so having done that for 5 years, I'm somewhere at the 17,000 pieces of content mark.
That's yeah, a huge amount. But also I think it's a little bit of an expanded definition of a blog, right? Where it's like not just the long form things here, but just everything everywhere.
Well,
Kind of.
I think even if you go back to Dave Weiner and gang's early definition of blogs, it didn't even include, I don't think it even included the idea of longer form pieces, because, some of their posts were, essentially the equivalent of a bookmark.
Yeah.
Or, a bookmark of here's an interesting site and here's 2 sentences I think about it. So it was really something you have and post on your own site. And, there was an issue, there's always been the thing about the time ordering, so the most recent thing is at the top typically.
Yeah.
Then the other part was that you have a distinctive voice. And since I post as me on all this stuff, it's obviously me and my voice rather than me speaking for some corporate entity or,
Yeah.
as a journalist for the New York Times or, whatever outlet it might happen to be. So as long as you've got those things, I think it kind of fits that broader
Yeah,
definition. But
I agree. So with the ways like the services you're generally pulling from, is it, I guess, what was the experience integrating with all of those? Were there like particularly hard fought battles to liberate your data from any of them, or has it been relatively straightforward to build
so
those pipes?
some of them, yes, some no. Not all services give you easy means of taking data out of them. Fortunately, there are a good number that either have or used to in the past support RSS.
Hmm.
So in some cases, probably around 2007, 2008-ish, there was a service called Posters. There was a blogging platform that started in the social media era, and ultimately it got picked up by and bought out by Twitter as an acqui-hire.
Hmm.
Um, and I'd had dozens and dozens of posts on it. I kind of tinkered around with it, similarly to the way I tinkered around with Tumblr in the early days. And I had content there, and before they closed down, they gave you the ability to export it in some reasonable manner. And it was just after that I probably exported it and then put it into this site
Gotcha.
to do that. So, some services are good at it, some are bad, some provide no export at all, some give you APIs. For me, the
Yeah.
easiest thing tends to be if they just give you a basic export in some common format. Because I, prefer to tinker with as little code as I possibly can. Um,
Okay.
but usually these days it's more a question of how to put new data into the site in a quick and easy way. So, if I'm watching TV and I want to say, hey, I watched this TV show and, write 2 snippets about it, how can I do that quickly and easily without, or if I'm out at the movies, how can I do that in the moment so that I'm
Yeah.
not disturbing the people around me from a social perspective, but still capture the data that I saw this movie on this day at this place.
And so do you have solutions for that for similar kind of data, or are you kind of, so this is
So
a
the
WordPress site, right?
so the site's built on WordPress, although I also have another site that's built on WithKnown. And generally I've set it up from the get-go so that acquiring my own data and posting data to it is as easy as possible. Um, and one of the things I picked up from the indie web movement is to focus on the things that interest me first. So if I
Okay.
want to track everything I watch on TV, how do I get that piece of data first? How do I build that? What do I use? And so typically my approach will be to go out and look at services that do that. So does IMDb give you data? Does Letterboxd give you data?
Hmm.
What are those services that support TV or movie watching, and how do you do that? So you can look at those as examples of how to do it and what works. How do you want your page to look? What data do you want on it? So in the TV example, do you want the episode name and the show? Do you want the season number? Do you want the episode number? Do you want cover art for it? And then
Yeah.
you figure out how to do those things.
So is the
Um,
TV one something you figured out here?
so there's a couple of services, like the simplest one, and they don't provide an easy way of doing it. But I found one of the quickest and easiest ways is to literally post to my website by email,
Huh.
um, or even use, at the lowest level services like If This Then That or Zapier
Gotcha.
that will do some of that automation stuff. So I can go to, let's say the quickest and easiest is to go to an IMDb page and mail that URL to my website. And then I have
Okay.
a setup on my website that will parse that page and scrape out the title, the description, any artwork if it exists.
Okay. That's really interesting. And
So in my case, a lot of that stuff, I'm letting some of the heavy work be done by a plugin called Postkinds. You can see my screen, right?
yep, yep.
Okay. So it's a simple plugin that you point and shoot. And here's a couple examples, or I can give you, I mean, we can even look at my site itself. Let's go to something I watched maybe yesterday. I, passively watched a couple episodes of The West Wing. So Postkinds gives me an interface that literally I can dump in a URL for the thing I watched. And in this case, IMDb tends to be a pretty good database for that kind of stuff, and it all exists. So I can throw it into this Postkinds plugin, and it'll automatically go to that page and scrape out, all the data you see for this watch, right here. It gives me the title. If I click on the link, it'll go to the IMDb page. I filled in the bit of data that I watched it via Netflix, but it pulled in the description. Here's an example of something I watched on, I watched the news last night on YouTube. So it'll pull in the data from the episode and then actually embed the thing. So you can watch the same thing I watched just
It's,
hours later.
I don't know if you would know this, but is the plugin scraping the page or like hitting the IMDb API?
No, it's literally scraping the page. So
Oh, okay.
there was a functionality built into WordPress it's one of the few things that they've actually taken out of core. And I think they took it out about a year ago because the usage of it was not huge, but it's since been built up and updated. So it's going to the page and it will look at 4 or 5 different types of metadata that almost every website supplies. So whether it's, I think it prefers microformats first,
Okay.
and then it'll look at open graph data that almost every website supplies for Facebook or
Yeah.
Twitter. After that, I think it looks at schema data. It'll also just look at raw HTML, so it'll take the title of a page and throw that back to you. And it does each of these in sequence and then has fallback. So by the time this thing is done parsing your page, it's got as much data as it generally can get,
Okay.
including an author name, an author URL, and an author avatar if it has those. Um,
That's super cool. So you can kind of just like throw whatever at it and you'll get something
yeah.
useful out of it.
So essentially, I can just do what is the equivalent of a bookmark, but in this case, it's a bookmark for things I've watched, and it's categorized that way. So I can say, "Hey, what did I watch?" and have a stream of. So you can, go to my website, type this URL in, and then add the word feed to it, and you can subscribe to an RSS feed
Huh.
of everything I watch, and it shows
Neat.
up roughly in real time.
That's super slick. So you have these kind of like activity feeds of yours. You have like what kind of things are you tracking here? Things you watch. I see audio there, so things you listen. Okay.
So the big ones, the articles is essentially what most people would call a traditional blog with the longer form content.
Okay.
Notes are short status updates type of content. Typically, I'll post it on my site and syndicate a copy to Twitter.
Gotcha.
If I reply to somebody else's website, I will. So in this case, we can look at this real quick. I can. This guy George posted a short note on micro.blog the other day. So here's the entirety of his post, so I have some context of what it was. I have a link to the thing itself. I have, a photo and his name, and then my reply to him shows up just underneath that. And then there's an indicator over here to the side that I um, syndicated a copy to
Yeah.
Microblog so that he can see it. So if I click on that and go to it, it should take you to the permalink for the copy, my copy of it on Microblog. So here's his original, and mine. It doesn't actually go to the permalink itself. Although it does highlight it. So here's my copy,
Okay.
and then at the bottom, here's a little, a hash symbol that's actually a link back to the original on my site. So you can go around in a circle.
Yeah.
Ideally, you should be able to go around in a circle like that on any post, but it allows me to own it and have pointers from my site to the copy and the copy back to my site.
So for things you're doing on like Twitter or other platforms, are you backlinking in a similar way?
I am, but you. Sometimes it's done in a more subtle way. And part of the reason I do that backlinking, let's go to here's an example. So I wrote this article in 2017 and posted it. And you'll see I've syndicated copies to half a dozen or almost a dozen
Yeah.
services, including Reddit. Um,
Hacker
there's a
News.
copy on
Yeah.
Hacker News. And this blew up on Hacker News the day that I posted it. So, my website tipped over because there were, 10,000 views inside of an hour. But I sent a copy to Medium, I sent a copy to Twitter and Tumblr and the whole 9 yards. But so the version I sent to Twitter, and I can click on a link and go to the original almost instantaneously.
Yeah.
So here's the copy I sent to Twitter. This has 48 retweets and 30 likes. So my website supports a spec called Web Mention, and there's a simple plugin for WordPress as well as a few other content management systems support this out of the box or with simple plugins now. But
Yeah.
you'll see that this post has 442 responses to it. This first one you'll see um, has a link to Facebook. So
Yeah.
the copy I sent to Facebook, I have a service called Bridgie
Yeah.
that is a handful of social sites. And when people reply to my posts, it uses my permalink URL and these syndicated URLs to match my post and the copy one to one and then send me replies. So, this has got a bunch of replies two from Facebook here. This one is native to my website. Somebody actually came to my site and typed in a comment. Um, Here's a reply from me that I actually wrote on Facebook that got sent back. Here's one from my mom because the post was about my mom. Um, but if I scroll down, all these responses are coming to my site via web mention.
Mm.
So even though there are copies of my post in other places on the web, when people are interacting with them in other places, I want all that data back so that I can see it in one spot.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I have to go and log into those 12 services to see, okay, what are they saying about me today? Or even to get notifications from 57 services, which is a little silly. I'd rather just have it all happen on my website and get one set of notifications from one
Yeah.
place that I can control. So here's a whole bunch of likes. You can see all the reposts. Somebody actually posted just that they were reading this article. And then there's a whole bunch of random mentions that, people mentioned my article somewhere on the
Yeah.
web. And so I have permalinks that go back to all of these things. Obviously, in this case, this is something that's 2 years old. So there's a lot of white spaces in here that essentially indicates the avatars have changed or the links to the avatars have changed.
Huh.
Because I don't yet do caching for these types of avatars. So
It would get pretty substantial, I imagine.
there is some link rot, but I do have links that go back to these things so I can see the original if it was liked on Twitter or somewhere else.
So
Um,
for Bridgie, what was the process of like setting Bridgie up? Because I've looked at it, but not kind of made the jump there.
So Bridgie is it's a free third-party service that it does two things. It bootstraps Twitter, Instagram, Flickr, GitHub, and as of about a week and a half ago, it now works with Mastodon. It bootstraps the APIs for those services so that when somebody likes or replies or comments on your post that's been syndicated, Bridgie, by logging into it, you tell it what your URL is, what your website is, and then you tell it what let's say your Twitter account is.
Yeah.
And then when you post, there's a permalink on your website for your piece of content, and you can either put that same permalink on Twitter or not. Bridgie actually has an algorithm, and it's smart enough to do it without having the reverse thing set up.
Okay.
But usually I find it's just as easy to throw that permalink in anyway. And 9 times out of 10, it tends to drive more traffic back to your site, which is where the traffic should be coming from anyway. But it'll take all those likes and comments and create little mini web pages for them, and then it will send a web mention back to your site on your behalf so that
Okay.
you can own that piece of data. And so essentially that's what it's doing. So if I go to, this may be a little bit on the technical side, but if I go, somebody sent me a comment, an hour ago from Bridgie.
And so
So
this is the actual like Bridgie
so
site that's sending the
here's
web.
the actual code that Bridgie processed the thing with.
Okay.
And somewhere on here there should be a permalink for. There's a way to create and look at the page. Maybe here it is. So it actually automatically redirects. So here, but this right here is the link, and it's a web page with essentially an avatar, a name, in the content it's sending back to me that's properly marked up. So, but when you click on it, Bridgie you see it for a second,
Okay.
then it auto redirects back to the original.
And so then on your WordPress end, is there something else that's receiving these web mentions and then like processing them?
So there's two pieces that do that. One is the web mention plugin that actually handles the infrastructure and the code for sending and receiving web mentions. And then there's another one called semantic link backs that does, essentially it's a parsing function that is used for, in this example, it pulls my icon off of Facebook, it takes my name, and then it formats all this stuff in a nice way to make it look like you would want a comment to look like on a website. So it essentially, other than it saying here, there's this little highlighted URL link to go back to the original on Facebook, except for this, if you came to my website and put in your name and email address and wrote your comment here, there shouldn't be a difference.
Gotcha.
So the semantic linkbacks plugin piece kind of makes all these comments look pretty and look native in some sense. Eventually, the developers who are doing that are going to merge both the web mention plugin and the semantic linkbacks plugin, because they're not dramatically different and they work hand in glove in a sense. I wouldn't recommend anyone use web mention without the semantic linkbacks on WordPress.
Is that just because it kind of gives you the raw
Yeah,
data?
they were developed in parallel, and then now they are being kind of joined together to make one simpler, easier to use plugin. But in a sense, both of them you can install and activate, and there really isn't a whole lot of, there's not a whole lot of settings one would do. But the other nice part too is every other website on the web that supports web mention will work in roughly the same way. So I think I pulled an example. I wrote this the other day about podcast discovery in a service called Huffduffer, and I posted it on my website. In this case, I didn't syndicate it anywhere, but my friend Gregor saw it in his feed reader, and he replied on. So he replied on his website. Put these tabs out.
And then just because he's sending out web mention.
So he's taken my thing and created a little card here that gives him some context of what he's replying to, and then he writes, this is his response. In his site, which is built, I want to say he hand-rolled most of this, if I recall. And he sent me a web mention, so my site receives it and shows it as a comment. And then I literally went and clicked the reply button and typed my comment in here. And one of the slick things WordPress does is it will send web mentions from comment forms.
Mm-hmm.
So my comment here then gets sent to his website and appears here. So we can do peer-to-peer conversations, or essentially at mentions, the way Twitter and Facebook and most other services do, but we're not limited by the URL we're sending it from, or the content management system, or the service we're doing it from.
Yeah, that is really, really slick. Was there
so it's the way that your cell phone system works. You can be on AT&T and I can be on Sprint, and as long as we both have phone numbers, we can call each other, and we don't need anything else. And for some reason, social media services don't want the web to work that way, because by owning and controlling your data, they own and control you and make more money as a result of it.
So was there a learning curve or technology curve to setting up the web mention stuff, or was it kind of just plug and play?
There was a little. The concept of doing it actually is fairly straightforward if you think of it in the in the app mentions framing.
Yeah.
And everybody app mentions everybody day in and day out. The weird part is doing it from one CMS to another, from one website to another. So 5 years ago, when a bunch of us started doing this, I think it was broken up into 3 or 4 different plugins, and there were problems and issues. But 5 years later now, you almost should be able, on at least with modern WordPress themes, you should be able to stick these 2 plugins. There's almost no configuration for them, and this stuff should just work.
Wow.
Now, obviously, a lot of the back end is built on some technical pieces called microformats.
Yeah.
So if you think of like a business card, if you went to a business card and you added microformats to it, you're essentially adding a tiny little bit of pieces. In the HTML parlance, they're just simple classes that you're adding to the HTML. And the classes you're adding are things like hcard, which is something that's, whether it's in a div or a span or whatever it is, maybe it's even in an h1 tag or an anchor tag, but you put an hcard microformat as a class on some piece of HTML, and it says everything that's in this container is essentially like a business card. And then there are microformats to say, this is my first name, this is my last name. One to say, this is an image that represents me, or my headshot, or my avatar. And then there are other microformats to say, this is my street address, this is my city, this is my zip code. But it allows computers to then parse that block and strip all the data that it needs out to, throw on, in this case, in web mentions, to put an avatar, or this one isn't a web mention, but this one up here for Gregor is, it'll put his image, his name, and it has a little microformat to say, this is my response, this piece. So if we go to Gregor's page, there's a lot of stuff on this page that isn't necessarily his response.
Do you
But
think
if
we
you
could,
look at,
if you just like inspect that HTML, it would have the microformat bit in there?
yeah, so if we go and look at his source, um, his div here has a p name and e content are two different um, microformats that are saying that this is the content right here. And then above, he has this p-in-reply-2 is the microformat that says this is his
In
response
response to, yeah,
to my URL.
gotcha.
I'm not aware of it, but you know, ostensibly one could also use schema markup or JSON LD markup, but I'm unaware of anybody who's doing that in the wild or who has written a parser that will look at a page and pull those things out for schema or JSON LD. Microformats go back, 20 plus years, I think, and so they're much stronger and more stable. And in WordPress's case, WordPress core actually goes in and supports Microformats version 1 from 15, 20 years ago.
Huh.
And there are even better, if you've got one and you can find a theme that actually supports Microformats 2, you even get some better metadata out of it, which makes doing this stuff even prettier.
And so then when you're sending a web mention, is it like hitting, so like, is there this
So
site?
if we use
Yeah.
let's use this case of this post I wrote and
Yeah.
Gregor sending me a response. So he writes his response here
Yeah.
and sends a web mention, and what the protocol does is it sends a ping, and here this URL right here is the permalink for my response. So
Okay.
his server is sending a ping to my website for this
Gotcha.
specific URL. My site receives it, and to cut down on spam, my server looks back at his to make sure that yes, indeed, the web page he's sending it from actually has my URL on it. And if it doesn't, it just rejects it out of hand, so I can't be spammed that way
Yeah.
or spammed easily that way. Um, and from there, it shows up as a comment in my WordPress backend, and I have the ability, I use Akismet to filter out spam as well. So I can use pre-existing spam filters to get rid of additional spam if somebody's wanted to be really a bad actor. But I can also moderate his response. I have a thing set up on my backend that actually I've received web mentions from him in the past. He's somebody I trust him, so my system says, if Gregor sends me a web mention, just accept it. Don't worry about it. But if some new person sent me one, it would be held in my moderation queue, and I can go in and decide to show it or not show it.
Gotcha.
So to a great extent, web mentions really are just the notifications back and forth. And then the semantic link backs piece, the other plugin, is really doing the parsing and pulling of data so that I can physically show it as a comment if I choose to.
That's a really slick setup. It seems like it. Yeah, like the
So,
interactions enabled are pretty sweet.
but to blow your mind even more, there are now people are building feed readers that that do bits and pieces of some of this stuff. So and most of these feed readers have been split into two parts. One is something that, and here's an example at aperture.p3k.io that I can put in my sources for feeds that I want to subscribe to. So let's say I subscribe to 6 or 7 here. And then there's a separate service that actually does the polling. Or this service does the polling and holds the data for this stuff. And then there's a separate reader called Monocle
Huh.
that does this stuff. So as I'm reading people's feeds, I can either like them, I can repost them, or I can, click reply, and I can type my reply directly in here. And when I hit reply, it actually sends this post to my website. So my reply will show up on my website with the context. And then my site then sends a web mention to the site that I've been reading, and then they receive the comment that way. So in some sense, there's now a full circle trail for what most social media websites do. The only difference is I'm using a third party reader to read and consume content rather than reading it on my own website.
Huh.
But I'm able to, using these readers, I'm able to own it. Now, just to give you a quick example of what it looks like, the other thing my site supports is a spec called Micropub. And my guess is you probably were on Twitter since 2008, 2009, maybe.
I'm recent to Twitter, but
More recent.
yeah.
So, but back in the day, there used to be 57 Twitter apps that you could use to post to Twitter.
Yeah.
But there were a few that would work with, and there are a few even now in modern times, like, and there are more corporate social media tools like Hootsuite, or I don't know, what's the other one? There's one or two that you can like type content in and then hit publish, and it'll post it to Twitter and Facebook and 3 other places.
Yeah.
Well, the indie web community thought this would be a cool thing to have, but it would be even better if we could do it to personal websites rather than to social media sites. So I can type in my domain name and sign into this application called Quill. It'll go to my site. If I'm not logged in, it'll ask me to log in so that I can authenticate and authorize it to create posts on my behalf, update them, and send me media. So I click authorize, and then this is all essentially an OAuth setup. So my WordPress website uses a plugin called IndieAuth. I think that's the right name, to allow it to act as an OAuth 2 provider, essentially. It's a little more technical than that, but essentially I get the security and the setup for it. So I can type in, a quick little status update. I can put in some tags maybe. I won't do a slug. I could add a photo if I want. I can choose from some syndication options. Maybe I want to add my geolocation. In this case, I won't. And then click post. And in the background, this is now sending a micropub request to my website with that data.
Okay.
When it's done, it will then redirect and show me this is that post on my website now with the date and time stamp. It's added the tag. And it's even kindly, it's automatically syndicated a copy to my WordPress.com account. But the nice part is that Quill will post a variety of, I can do full articles. In fact, it does it has a nice medium light interface that I can do photos, text, write full articles. I can, this was the note, if I want to add an event to my website or a bookmark, let's say, I can add likes or reposts. So let's say I did a book. If I wanted to bookmark something, all I need to do is put in a URL or name or content. Yeah. Actually, it's even easier. Down on the bottom, it's got a bookmarklet. So I can be on the web page I want to bookmark and click the bookmarklet, and it'll just go. But these types of, and there's probably 30 or so micropub clients out there that make it stupidly easy for me to post almost any kind of content I want to my site, which is awesome.
Yeah.
And anybody can build one. And if you build it, you're not building it. So let's say as an example, a lot of people may know that WordPress has been building and rolling out this massive new back-end
Gutenberg
tool
or
called Gutenberg.
yeah,
Yeah. So hundreds of thousands of hours and developer time has been built and gone into this thing. And at the same time, I can get maybe not quite the value out of it, but I can use Quill's simple text editor. Or if you wanted to build a custom text editor, I'm almost waiting for somebody to take the Gutenberg backend and turn it into a micropub endpoint.
yeah, and then you could
So
use
that you
that
can
whether you're
post
using
anywhere.
WordPress or not, right? Like any
Yeah.
site. Okay.
So, and there's a plugin that does micropub for Drupal, let's say. So it could work with any CMS that has an endpoint to receive the data.
Yeah.
And then once it receives the data, knows exactly what to do with it, how to post it. And some are more sophisticated than others. Some will allow you to post this stuff as a draft or a
Where it
review
really becomes
copy.
like a
So it
headless
posts to your
editor.
backend, but doesn't automatically publish it. It would be kind of cool if Medium.com would turn itself into a micropub endpoint. Then you could use
That would be
Medium's
crazy.
editor and not post just to Medium.com, but also post it to your own website.
That would be the
Um,
day.
and how awesome would that be?
Yeah,
So
seriously. Yeah. So maybe on a less technical track, but I'm super into the technical side, so I love that. But in terms of like I don't know, feeds of, because you're seemingly pulling a lot of feeds from a lot of different places into your site, right? On a more like day-to-day level, how do you interact with those? Like, do you find yourself going back to the feeds of the things you watched or the things you listened to kind of like discover things, or what's the kind of process
So
of that?
usually, most of the stuff I consume, I try and consume it in a feed reader. So even my Twitter account, usually I have a bunch of Twitter lists that I throw into a service that outputs an RSS feed. So I use an RSS reader to read Twitter. And more often than not, I try and read longer content anyway, unless it's social stuff from people that I'm interested in.
Okay,
But generally, and so here, a good example may be, so I have an annotation post kind on my website that collects annotations of things that I've read. So in this case, I annotated this article that was written by the community manager of micro.blog.
cool.
So I highlighted something that she wrote and I wrote a quick little response to it. And there's actually a link here I can click on and go to the original. And in this case, I used, and I think Tom Critchlow
Hypothesis, right?
mentioned
Yeah.
Hypothesis a few weeks ago. So
Yeah.
I've been using it for quite a while. So I can, I've got a little bookmarklet up here that'll turn it on and off, and I can highlight pieces of text. I can respond to it and add tags, and then publish it either for myself or publicly. But Hypothesis, they both have an API backend, but it was easier and cheaper to use their RSS feed.
Hmm.
So my website pulls in their RSS feed and creates posts of everything I annotate online.
And so then
Um,
those annotation posts, like, do you ever interact with that post category? Like, are you going back and looking through annotations here, or is it more just like a
so
historical
it's
store?
some of it is in a sense, you know, and it's you mentioned in the invitation for this that I'm using, and I stated on the front page of my website that I'm using my website as a commonplace book. And essentially, it's a commonplace book was a social construct from the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance. Books were expensive, so you would get a book, you would read it. If you saw interesting things in it, you would copy those parts and quotes into your commonplace book or your notebook. You might keep copies of receipts in it. You might keep notes about who you've paid, who you didn't pay, who you owe things to. You might write poetry, haiku, you know,
Yeah.
almost an early version of Twitter in some sense, but it was one that only you read because you had your big notebook with all this stuff in it.
Yeah.
So sometime after I joined the indie web, I realized that wait, I'm using my website as a modern day digital, commonplace book. So as I'm reading, and there's some stuff I read for academic research, and that I refer back to, or that use as I'll cite in other places and use footnotes. But all that stuff is collected if it's an online, or there's an online way to do it. I'll do that and put it on my website so that I have the quick ability to, I don't necessarily need to remember it, or even if I have a sketchy memory of it, I can search for tags or keywords and find it
Okay.
on my digital notebook, and then use that as content to write a longer reply.
And so you'll just use the like normal search functionality here and kind of that'll,
So I can,
yeah.
a few years ago, I read a book by David Christian on the topic of big history, let's say. So I can't, nope, I didn't hit search. Helps if you actually search. So here's one I'm reading now. So I wrote a mini review of it when I read it. And then I realized that when I did read it, I read an electronic version on my Kindle. So I have a bunch of my Kindle highlights and notes and data about my reading progress.
Ooh,
I know which days I read how much of and which sections.
that's pretty cool.
But then I have all my highlights, quotes, and marginalia from the digital version of everything I highlighted.
How
If I
are
find interesting words, I might highlight them in orange on my Kindle. There's a
how did
few.
you pull the highlights off of the Kindle? I like was looking around for a while for a way to do that and couldn't figure it out.
So I've written a post on how I do it, and it's hiding somewhere on my website. So if you
Okay.
search for Amazon Kindle, you'll pull it up. And there's a few others, but there's a text file on all Kindles.
Oh
When you
yeah.
highlight stuff, it writes it to that. So literally, you can go to that and pull out. So I just pulled that big chunk out and then added a little bit of markup to it and threw it on a web page. And
The weird
here
thing with
are all
I
my.
think it's called like I forget what the file's called, but it really threw me off that it's an append only file. So if you delete a highlight or change it, it just like adds a new one into it. It's really strange.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bizarre that way, but apparently I wasn't taking heavy notes, or I, my guess is I was reading it on my older Kindle, which had the crazy old keyboard, so typing notes into it was a pain in the neck. Although I do have a few little annotations here that I've thrown in.
Uh,
Um,
I
but
ended up
everything I highlighted in the book now is on this page with my review, so I can go back and find it and search for it. And then there's a little guide to the highlight colors, so I can, search this page for, the word
yeah,
red, and find examples of things that I want to work through or think back through, or references that I want to go back and find and read.
nice.
Um, or let's say I wrote an article and I want to, you know, highlight this thing that pops up, I can create a permalink to that exact piece of context, and it'll
Oh,
create a long thing. So if I open a new tab and type that crazy URL in, it'll open that page,
right there.
scroll to that section, and highlight it in yellow for me. So typically, when I even do self references to my own website, this thing is called a frag mention. So I can create permalinks to not even sections of a page, but I can, if I wanted to do it and I wanted to highlight,
Just like
usually
words
it,
even.
I can highlight specific words and find that. Usually it'll highlight the smallest div or span in which those words appear. So I could set it up certainly so I could target individual words at a time, but
Yeah.
it's usually easier to have it highlight an entire like small section
Makes sense.
so that you've got context. But I
Uh,
always find especially for the academic side of doing academic research and throwing this stuff out, this is uh, a ridiculously awesome little tool to, or a piece of functionality to have on my website that
yeah,
it's a little piece of JavaScript code that runs in the background.
that is really cool. This might be a good point since we're like about 50 minutes in to if anyone listening in has any questions or stuff they'd like you to dig into, uh, open it up. You could either speak up
Oh
or
yeah,
just like drop it into the chat.
yeah. I haven't been watching the chat here. I probably should pull it open.
CJ is asking what barriers, whether technical, social, or motivational, keep people from doing this kind of indie web stuff.
So part of it depends on where you fall on a spectrum and how comfortable you are doing bits and pieces of it. So I would say, it, if I was going to do some of this stuff for my mom, I probably would do a $5 a month account on micro.blog. Is one of the few kind of paid indie web as a service platforms that's out there. And it'll let you do articles and notes, photos. To my knowledge, I think it's got all the big indie web specs built into it from scratch. So it's a turnkey solution that you can have, but you go out, you buy a domain. In fact, in the last month, they've added the ability that when you sign up, you can buy your domain through them as well. So they literally is a one-stop shop for doing this now. But if you have a pre-existing domain, you can go to them and say, I want to put a micro.blog instance on my domain. Here's $5 a month, and then, post to your heart's content. That may not give you the flexibility that I've got being able to tinker with everything from soup to nuts on my site, but that's the lowest of low barriers. And then beyond that, both WordPress and WithKnown, I think, are probably two of the easier to use self-hosted versions that will allow you to do most of this. And then the technical requirement, and at the very worst, if you can't do it yourself, you can get a company or someone else to host it for you and do the basic setup. And then as long as you're able to add plugins and then write your own content, using their interface, it's really not that hard. So, if you can find a host like, Reclaim Hosting, or honestly, almost every host out there has a one-click install that you can use for WordPress. And then if you can go in and add the 3 or 4 plugins that do this, you can have a lot of this power yourself. Now, in my case, I've gone in and I try and touch as little code as I possibly can to do this, in some sense, to dog food it and help the developers who are making it out. But I've gone in and written or cut and pasted little sections of code to add things like annotations and how that displays on my website. So I've touched a little bit of code to do some small bits and pieces here. But in general, one of the other ones I did, and mostly I did it as a proof of concept, but I created a chicken post type on my website. So it will say I chickened, and then here's a photo of some chicken stuff I took when I was at Knott's Berry Farm. And when I posted it, my back end literally pulls it in so much metadata. It'll tell me it was 65 degrees Fahrenheit and clear that day. So I even know what the weather was like outside on the day I took this photo.
Nice.
Or, if I bookmark other posts about chickens, Uh, you know, somebody had a chicken tweet.
I saw that one. Yeah.
So I did this mostly as a proof of concept. And of course, if you have chicken posts, you have to send them to the bird site. Haha. Um, so, but I did this as a proof of concept to show how easy it is to take a plugin like Postkinds and create new ridiculous kinds of posts. Not that I really needed the chicken post kind, but the nice part is now if you type in the /FEED at the end of that, at the end of the URL
Yeah.
for chickens, I have a chicken feed.
Nice.
So,
So in terms of like experimenting with new things, it sounds like Postkinds is kind of like the basis for creating a lot of these things, and then there's layers on.
It's an easy way for doing that and doing it on WordPress.
Yeah.
The Indie Web Wiki, which is at indieweb.org. I think they've got a lot of research on, let's see, where is the page? I know how to find it and get there, I think. Yeah, well, this is actually probably not a bad example. So here's a page for check-ins. So they'll have research of prior existing art on the web of what check-ins looked like on Swarm and Foursquare, let's say, or Gowalla, or Dodgeball and Facebook. And this is how they've been implemented and what they look like, the type of data they'll have, how those posts were formatted and what they look like on those services. So that if you decide whether you're using WordPress or writing custom code for your own website or CMS or platform, whatever it happens to be, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and you can look at what those examples look like. And some of these pages are incredibly well documented in terms of how to publish them, what kind of markup to write. If you're writing it from scratch yourself, they'll have data on examples of other indie websites that have implemented this stuff themselves. What do those look like? How are they written? How are they marked up? And there's a bunch of examples as well as photos for that. There's 50 or 60 people here who have written or built some version of check-ins for their own website. How do you do that? What does it look like? They'll even have links to sessions where these things have been discussed at, conferences or camps. They'll have brainstorming sessions. They'll have pros and cons of different things. In fact, this actually turned out to be a good example of doing that. Abandoned brainstorms, things people tried and that didn't work, why they didn't work. How can these be abused? So if there's examples of people abusing check-ins on Swarm in real life, they'll try and find those examples and throw them in here so that if you're developing this for yourself, what should you watch out for and those kinds of things. But if we go,
I sent the link for the general Postkinds, I think, in the Zoom chat.
Here's kind of a broad category for post types. Somewhere on the wiki here, there's an example though but this is essentially all of the different types people. And in my experimenting, the majority of the time, most post types really amount to fancy bookmarks.
Okay.
So I have specific bookmarks on my website, and those are things typically that I haven't read yet. I might want to come back and revisit later on. But if I've actually read the thing and played around with it, or read a page or read an article, I have a post type called read on my site to do that. Highlights and annotations obviously are bookmarks of things that exist somewhere else on the web that I've either highlighted or wanted to highlight or wrote a note about. Favorites are bookmarks that I really like, ideally that I've read, the additional implication is I've read the thing and I liked it, or it's one of my favorite things. So, half of these things really on this list amount to being exotic versions of bookmarks, or even things like, I have one of the few examples of itches are things that I want to fix or change or do on my website that I wanted to make a note of and have a specific category of. I saw this thing and I want to build it for myself or have it on my own website. And how do I do that? So it,
Yeah.
It all kind of lives there.
Sweet. What are some example of as of yet unscratched itches?
We can go to it and take a look. I haven't updated this in a while. So I want to create an editorial mark on my website. So in the newspaper business, editors will write TK in text to mean something is to come or coming later on.
Okay.
So it'd be nice if I could highlight a chunk of text and then have a little TK mark show up on the outside. And there's, and I have some examples of what this stuff looks like on Medium. So I saw this on Medium, like, hey, that's kind of an interesting little
that is
UI
cool.
tweak. And I documented the example that I saw. This is what it looks like. This is where I saw it and what it does. And then in my case, I documented this and probably created a copy on the Indie Web Wiki of this thing exists. Improve my following page presentation and data flow. I think I've got it over here. So I have a following page of all the websites, corporate, personal, or otherwise, that I'm following on the web in my feed reader. So if you want, so I've got a list of, 50 indie web websites and people who build them that I'm following.
Awesome.
People who are into indie web and education, I've got a big list of those. And it's essentially a photo, a permalink to their website, and a quick description of who they are and what they're talking about. Typically, if they've got something simple that's in their own words, I'll copy it from their own website. But the nice part is, and this page goes on, this is a lot of stuff to follow. But let's say you want, so at the bottom, I've got a little description of what's going on and what it's doing. But if you want to follow all the indie web people I'm following, I have an OPML subscription link that you can go to. And you can take this link and dump it into most feed readers' OPML setups. And essentially, it will give you the name of the site, the permalink to find it at, and the site where it lives, as well as the specific feed I'm following. So you can dump this URL link at the top into your feed reader of choice, and you can automatically follow everybody I'm following. And it will take you and do it by category. So if you're only interested in the educators who are in the indie web and nothing else, you can find a link on my site, throw it into a feed reader, and instantly be following the 50 plus people without spending the 5 hours cutting and pasting all that data back and forth.
That is awesome, and I will probably be hitting that exact feed.
So it's there, it's out there. I've built these things or used them. In this case, this page is mostly built using WordPress's old link manager functionality that it's still in core, but essentially was taken out of core and is made as a plugin. But I found a new way to use that and use it in kind of an indie web way.
Yeah.
But also make it useful for other people who quickly want to,
super useful.
Like if you're a mathematician and you want to follow all the mathematics stuff I'm following, you should be able to do it almost as easily as you could follow, let's say, a Twitter list on Twitter.
Yeah.
but somebody's got a Twitter list on their Twitter account, you can click one button and subscribe to it and follow it, or go down that list and follow all those people in 10 seconds instead of having to search and hand curate it all yourself.
Sweet. I feel like we have barely scratched the surface, but I think it probably, yeah, we're like pushing up on hour plus. So
yeah, eventually people got to eat dinner.
True. So yeah, any kind of last questions, or is there stuff you wanted to get to that we didn't
Well,
cover?
if folks have questions and want to dig around, feel free to dig around the site. I have a page for somewhere at the end here. I have a page called Indie Web Collection that is a bunch of articles that where I've documented bits and pieces of things that I've done, how I built them, how they're set up. So if you know no code, most of these will have little snippets of code or walkthroughs of how to set it up, how to make this stuff happen. If you don't use WordPress and you use something else, go to the IndieWeb chat. I think chat.indieweb.org will pop up and give you a web, and you can hop in and ask questions of hundreds of other people, many who've done this before, can help you out, or at least point you in the right direction. And if you want to build it or do it yourself.
Awesome.
That's so. And I'm here and hanging out most days. So if you have questions, it's a quick and easy way to get to me.
Sweet. In the chat, Mark's asked, do you teach or do you consult or anything like that?
I do go around and I've done lectures at conferences. It's been several years since I've taught specific courses, but I used to lecture in film and media studies at Johns Hopkins a couple years ago, and it's tough to get away and do long classes from the West Coast.
Yeah.
And I do consult and I will build sites like this or build sites for people, and then typically I'll add in some of these additional layers for folks who need them.
Sweet.
So a little bit of all of it.
Sounds like it. Also an app description for your website, I think.
And somewhere in the deep bowels of my website, I've got a draft of a book that covers most of this. I just need to finish it up and
that would be a
push it
sweet
out.
book.
So, well, hopefully with this being NaNoWriMo, I may actually get around to finishing it.
Nice.
We'll see what happens.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for the tour, Chris. That was very enlightening on the indie web, and also just like making it work and seeing how it all comes together.
Well, hopefully somebody saw something crazy they want for themselves. I think that usually 9 times out of 10, I see somebody else's website. Hey, how did they do that? I want that.
Totally. Yeah. That's a big impetus for doing these things. So I hope so too.
Then you end up with a Christmas tree website like mine that just has, that has chickens on it.
I mean, I think it's great. Yeah.
So be careful.
The rabbit hole goes deep. Yeah. So thank you guys for coming, CJ, Mark, and we had Alex who dropped off. But yeah, I'll stop the recording.